Last time I came almost to the conclusion of my business plan, and the business plan was designed to help my colleagues and any young students that wanted to learn how to conduct practices, to help them to create their practices in a healthy and vibrant way, and to do so without being dependent on insurance reimbursement, because I was coming to feel that the healthcare delivery system in the United States was a very toxic environment for psychologists to work with. And to the extent possible, we should abandon seeing ourselves as healthcare providers and depending on reimbursement from the mechanisms within the healthcare system for paying our fees. As part of that, I was aided by the fact that I had been called upon to teach a course in lifespan developmental psychology. The opening happened at the California School of Professional Psychology. I was happy to jump on board and take it up because I was interested in the topic myself and wanted to learn more myself. And as I immersed myself in those contents, I came to see something powerful, that the literature and the research and what moves forward in developmental psychology is done mainly by academicians. But I saw there were rich possibilities for those of us who practice with troubled lives. There were insights there and potential pointing toward things that we ought to pay attention to that would be useful for conceptualizing what our work consisted of. Our work consists of helping people to rise to developmental challenges. It can be thought of as that way, from that frame of reference, rather than helping people to overcome psychopathology, which I hate, and I'll get into at some point even more. So the end of the business plan has a whole bunch of suggestions about developing symbiotic relationships with gatekeepers who are out there in the community, helping people with sources of modes of distress and sources of challenge they're experiencing. And these are places that people go. They see no relevance or wouldn't even think of going to a psychologist because these kinds of problems are arising in their life. And nevertheless, psychologists have a lot to say, particularly if they know a lot about developmental psychology, about where their distress is coming from and what services a psychologist could provide in addition to or over and above what's being provided by the gatekeeper that would be very helpful in them learning to manage their lives better. And I put it together in a chronological fashion from the beginning of life, infertility and adoption, where it's hard to get life started, through successive stages as the lifespan unfolds, all the way through further down the page, empty nest turbulence when the children are leaving home, marital ennui, where the couple is left alone now and they've been married for many years and they don't know how to keep their marriages vital because nobody's taught them about that. Uh, then there are variations of ordinary normative patterns. Here's marital dissolution and stepfamily creation. Ordinarily, a psychologist is not consulted about those things. The family law attorneys are, step-family associations are, clergy are, and on and on. Retirement turbulence, and then I have other variants. I like things going on in health psychology too. Adjusting to a heart attack has many psychological components to it. The causing of a heart attack has many psychological components to it. It's possible to learn how to intervene, how to talk to people who are at risk for heart attacks, how to help them with their lifestyle, how to manage stress, a whole bunch of things psychologists can do. Uh, as a matter of fact, I love what some of my colleagues are learning about it as they do empirical research. Uh, if one has a bad coronary prognosis and seems to require open heart surgery to be able to heal and have a better shot at life, there's a strong thing a psychologist can do that costs practically nothing. And insurance companies are even beginning to be willing to reimburse for this. If a psychologist goes and meets with the person who's going to have the open heart surgery the day before and creates a good enough relationship so that the person having the surgery can talk about inner fears and worries and anxieties that are boiling. Am I going to die on the operating table? Is the surgery going to be botched? Is this going to interfere with, am I going to have leftover residual difficulties after this? Am I going to need a lot of rehab? Am I going to lose my sexual potency if I go through the surgery? Many, many fears and preoccupations. If they can talk to a psychologist about them and get A, some practical knowledge, and B, some emotional warmth and kindness and empathy for the terrors and demons they're fighting with, as well as the trauma of having to go through the surgery. That in itself is helpful. And if the psychologist comes back not 1 day later, but 2 days after the surgery, because the surgery is very painful, and the patient is usually kept pretty zonked on pain medication for the first 24 hours. But if the psychologist comes back and talks to the client about how he or she experienced the near-death experience, what they're going through now, explains to them what the doctor's going to ask by way of rehab in the time ahead, offers to be available anytime the patient wants to consult with them about matters that might be troublesome. Those 2 days of consultation with the psychologist, 2 1-hour visits, result in a hospitalization stay that's 2 days shorter than it would be if no psychologist called on the person. And they consume much less pain medication. And they pay attention to and participate in the rehab planning with a higher degree of compliance than if the psychologist had never shown up. It's a very cost effective and very useful thing that we can do. There are similar protocols for dealing with women that have to have mastectomies, where psychologists are very useful. So the field of health psychology is going to grow and expand. And any of my colleagues who want to move out of just a psychotherapy practice and learn how to help people manage physical challenges can certainly put an adjunct on the end of their practice that would be useful, and maybe work out a good relationship with the doc in charge of that, who would let them do this in the doc's office. And then there are a whole bunch of things that psychologists do to try and work with people who are off the rails with regard to ways they've learned to soothe themselves. All of us have to learn to soothe ourselves. Some of us listen to music, some of us meditate, some of us masturbate, but some of us are engaged in self-soothing behaviors that are really harmful. They do harm to others and harm to the self. Some of us cut, some of us have eating disorders of one sort or another. Some of us engage in chemical abuse of one sort or another. Some of us engage in internet or pornography addiction. And we leave a wake of destruction, not only in our own path, but in the path of other people we're attached to. So learning to deal with various kinds of addictive behavior is very, very useful too. And while people go to rehabs, they go to 12-step programs. I think a good relationship with a wise psychologist is very helpful in surrendering, moving on developmentally into self-soothing and other ways that can be more constructive, can even be a lovely sublimation that does goodness in the world and makes less trouble for the self and for others. So that's all I'm going to say about this at the moment. So other than to say there are three branches of my dismay that led me to leave the healthcare delivery system and to adopt developmental perspectives. I've mentioned two of them: the growing horror in the financing of healthcare and the growing restrictions on who we could be, what we could do, how much we could charge, third-party intrusions on our relationship with our clients, my exposure to the perspectives of people who are interested in lifespan developmental psychology. And the third thing that moved me on was my real anger with and feeling dissatisfied with the medical model. Since we had signed on to be part of the healthcare delivery system, we had to conduct our lives in a way that mimicked the lives of physicians. And I got very angry about it after a while. I thought it was very limiting, very stupid, and led us nowhere. And I remember having had the following encounter. I was at the engagement party of a very, very wealthy friend of mine. He was a man who I thought would never get married. He uh, he had had a whole bunch of serial monogamous relationships, many of which lasted one night, and others went on for a few days. But he stuck with nobody for more than a week or two. He was very masterful at finding some flaw in them, something that clearly ruled out the possibility that anything enduring or ongoing could go on for him. And much to my surprise, here he was, somebody had finally gotten over whatever were the barriers and had persuaded him to get engaged. I still wasn't sure that whether he was going to get married or not, but he at least was getting engaged and was having a party. He was 50 at that time. He'd probably gone through 1,000 women he complained to me about by the time he got to be 50. So I was really interested in going there to see what was happening and who this woman was who had managed finally to put some kind of stardust in his eyes and get him to say, I want to marry you. And of course, he had only about 300 of his nearest and dearest whom he had invited to this event. It was at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in a large ballroom there. And I showed up. My wife was not interested in going. She never liked this guy, and so but I went. I honored him, and there were two bars, one at each side of the ballroom. I was standing in line to get a drink. It was fairly early. The formal parts of whatever the ceremony was going to consist of were not going to start for a while. So I did whatever people ordinarily do. I started gossiping with the people in line. And the guy in front of me started to talk to me, and he asked the usual question, what do you do for a living? He said to me, oh no, the first question is, how do you know so and so? Do you know the bride or the groom? And I said that I knew the groom. He knew he and his wife who were there knew the bride to be. So I said, I'm really surprised. The groom has been a man who spent time with literally hundreds of women. I'm surprised that he's agreed to settle down with anybody. So I'm curious and I'm here. Then the next question was, what do you do for a living? And I said, I'm a psychologist. Well, are you in practice? He said, yes. He said, well, my wife's a child psychologist. She's in practice too. And then he started laughing, what sounded like a derisive laugh. And I said, is there something funny about my being in practice as a psychologist? He said, no, I was feeling sorry for you. I'm trying to get my wife ready for what's coming. Well, what's coming that you feel sorry for me about? He said, well, I used to call myself a psychologist, he said, but I'm not a psychologist anymore. I'm a neuroscientist. I'm at the Brain Research Institute at UCLA. And he said, really exciting things are happening in my lab. At this very time, we are trying out a chemical that we think is going to cure depression. And it seems very effective. We have succeeded in getting dogs very depressed. We've given them a lousy quality of life. And then we give them this chemical, and suddenly they perk up and they wag their tails again, and they're very happy, even though their lives haven't changed very much. And we're just starting the field trials on human beings. We believe that this chemical is going to cure depression. And we have a whole array of things up on our whiteboard in the office, and with the help of the drug company who's funding this. And we're going to take on the major things that are making people miserable in the culture, one after another. We're moving on to anxiety after we get the depression medication ready. And within a short period of time, there won't be anything that you need to treat anymore because you're not scientific and you take a long time, and it's gross, and it's not very sophisticated, and it's not very effective. It's a lot of talking about, I don't know what the success rate is you guys are engaged with, and we'll be able to do it much simpler with just giving people a prescription for pills that they'll take, and there'll be no need to talk to you anymore. So I wanted to kill him on the spot. I was incensed with his arrogance and his stupidity. And I was either blessed or cursed with two streams of thought. When I was an undergraduate at UCLA myself, I had taken a minor in philosophy. So I knew a lot about philosophy, and I was particularly interested in the philosophy of science. I also had to take a course in neuroanatomy and neurofunctioning as part of my training to be a psychologist. That was one of the external courses we had to take from a neurologist. That was a required thing we had to pass on the way to our PhD, just like we had to pass reading in 2 languages. So I knew the rudiments, at least, of how the nerve system functioned, the spinal nerves, and what the anatomy of the brain was, and the the cortical nerves, and the rest. And I knew something about the chemistry that took place at the synapse. So I said, what is the area of action of this chemical you're looking at? He said it's a serotonin reuptake blocker. And I said, serotonin. If I remember, because I've had a course in neurology, serotonin is one of the chemicals that's secreted at the nerve synapse when the pulse passes from the axon of one to the dendrite of one to the axon of another. That's the chemical that's secreted that facilitates the electronic transmission across the gap. Is that correct? Yeah, that's correct. So what is depression? Depression is trouble with the reuptake mechanism. It clears the synapse too early, and it needs to stay there longer so there can be more full transmission. And if you give a chemical that permits that to happen, then the junction works more effectively, and that is the cause of the lifting of the depression. Depression is caused by inadequate serotonin in the junction in the brain. I said, well, wait a minute. Serotonin. I assume that's a complex hydrocarbon molecule, serotonin. Yes, I could give you the formula for it if you want. I know where the chlorine atoms are, and the nitrogen atoms, and the carbon atom. I said, no, I just wanted to know it is a biochemical compound. Yes, it is. And it is composed of molecules linked together. Yes, it is. Now, wait a minute. Aren't the molecules made of atoms that are linked together at a much more level of greater invisibility and tininess? There are atoms making up molecules. Yes, I told you what the atoms are. I forgot how many of each he said and what the linkages are. But yes, they're atoms. And I said, no, wait a minute. If I understand my high school physics, the atoms themselves are made up out of neurons, protons, and electrons whirling around the neurons and protons in the central core of the atom. Is that correct? Yes. And every molecule has not only chemicals in it, but the chemicals are atoms made up of linked atoms. Yes. And aren't we now starting to follow interest in subatomic particles? There seem to be things like quarks and neutrinos, even those things we thought were the basic building blocks, the protons, the atoms, and the neutrons. themselves may be composed of subatomic particles that are linked together to create them. And he said, I guess so. And I said, you tell me that what I do as a psychologist is not scientific. And real science is taking place where you're working. It's taking place at the level of complex biochemical molecules, which are being secreted at something called the nerve junction, the synapse. And he said, yes, that's where science is. Well, what's wrong with the science of the biochemistry of what's going on there? Isn't the very synapse itself the tissue of the I'm blocking on the names of the two sides of the synapse. The tissue of one side is also living material. I assume that's made out of biochemical compounds, living material. And the axon and the dendrite. And the dendrite itself is made out of biochemical molecules. He said, yes, I suppose so. Why is not that the correct level of analysis? And I yelled out, is there a biochemist here? We need help with this argument. I said, I'll bring a biochemist here and I'll see, is what you're doing just nonsense on a wave? The real wave is at the level of biochemical activity, not the wave of electronic transmission embedded in some biochemical broth that's there. And wait a minute, maybe we need an atomic physicist here because those are really atoms whirling around in all of us. Maybe an atomic physicist could write a uh, a calculus diagram, a math analysis diagram of the movement of all the molecules of my body. And that would explain my behavior, my moods, and everything. Because in the end, all of that is being lived by molecules that are moving around and interacting with each other. So why don't we get a wise physicist here to write a description on, is there a blackboard in this room somewhere? Maybe he could parse out the billions of atoms and molecules that are marching around it and write what's happening, why they're in motion in this way and that way and some other way. Or maybe we need to go to the subatomic people and to the Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy, which says that observing phenomenon deform them. And maybe we ought to try and see how quarks and neutrinos fit into the scheme. And on top of that, now that I think about it, we're marching towards something called string theory, which says that all activity, all phenomena take place in a 13-dimensional space. And what's happening in that space could be best understood and analogized by the vibration of 13 different kinds of strings. And that's where physics seems to be headed right now. Maybe that's the foundational basis on which we can understand everything. Maybe what you're doing is really pseudoscience too, just like what I'm doing. And then I said, on top of that, by the way, I said to him, you're committing what the philosophers of science call the reductionist fallacy. That fallacy says if you're observing anything, something is going on at a lower level of analysis. And the real science is to go down a level of analysis and see what's going on there. You'll be able to predict and control what's happening with greater precision. But the philosophers of science say that's nonsense because there is what's called an infinite regression. Wherever you stop to look, under that something is happening. And if you stop and look there, under that something is happening. And we're only moving along with adding. In the last 100 years, we've added about 5 levels of understanding of the building blocks of the universe to what we used to have. And we're still moving downward. We're into string theory now. I don't know where the hell we're headed from there. And I will finally stop my argument with you by saying there are others among us who annoy me too, who don't believe in the reductionist fallacy. They believe in the superordinate fallacy. We have family systems theorists and other kinds of systems theorists that say it's a mistake to think of the individual human life. All of us are just nodes in a complex human system. If you want to help somebody, It may be useless to try and just talk to that person or give that person a pill of some kind that changes their mood. The level of intervention may have to be the family or maybe even the community. It may have to be some much larger system. And the systems theorists and sociologists are well aware of certain phenomena. When the unemployment rate in the culture goes up above 10%, suicide rates and murder rates start skyrocketing when that happens. And when when the rate of inflation in the country goes beyond certain rates, the admission to mental hospitals go up with diagnoses of major depression and of schizophrenia. So maybe those conditions are being caused by economic circumstances and not by transmission of neurons. And I say, well, I'm going to rest my case. I think we're like blind man of the elephant. Everybody has a piece of something and everything is integrated. All of it lays on top of all of the other stuff. And the philosophers of science say, stick to your own home. If you're a psychologist, find psychological explanation, find psychological concepts and explanations for phenomena that you're looking at that are psychological. Don't pull in something from sociology or pull in something from physiology to fill in the gaps in your knowledge because you're going to muck things up and you're going to stop the march forward of your own discipline if you do that. That's a cheap and easy way to think you've arrived at greater knowledge, but you haven't. You're only stealing something that doesn't fit where you're trying to cram it, and it's not going to help you at all. I similarly don't believe, as a final note, I kept promising final notes, the joy I saw among my colleagues. There was a New York Times article. The article said, psychotherapy cures depression. And there are already out there some things that you think are probably terrible pills, but there are some current pills that are in use in psychiatry. And this was an attempt to do a controlled study. Three groups of people were identified. What's called, you probably know it, the Beck Depression Inventory. I think you're probably going to use it yourself for identifying the subjects of this wonder chemical you're working on. You find people whose Beck score really shows no great tendency towards depression, and you can find people who are seriously depressed according to the Beck inventory. Now, have three groups running. This study had three groups running. They had people who had no diagnosable depression according to the Beck's inventory. And then they had people who were very depressed according to Beck, and they were given medication as per whatever were the rituals for dispensing the medication. And then there was the third group. They were given psychotherapy and no medication. They were also very depressed. Weekly visits of psychotherapy. And for the treatment groups, the treatment went on for 6 months. 6 months of medication and 6 months of psychotherapy. And at that point, all treatment stopped. And 6 months later, there was a follow-up. The people who didn't seem terribly depressed continued to seem not terribly depressed. There were some exceptions. Some had fallen into bad life circumstances and were now mildly depressed, but they didn't have any major depression. Of the two groups who had treatment, one was the physiological treatment of pills, and the other was the psychological treatment. The the psychological group made great gains, as did the pill group made great gains, but that may have been placebo effect. However, the great gains of the people taking the pills had decayed and they were very depressed again if they weren't taking their medication. While the people who took were given the psychotherapy, they were functioning at a much higher level 6 months later and continued to maintain their gains. So the headline said, psychotherapy permanently changes brain functioning. And my colleagues were very happy to hear that. And I wasn't. That enraged me too. Psychology did nothing of the sort. Psychotherapy did not change brain functioning. We are mind body. What psychology changed was it gave people hope. It may have given them some practical skills with living with their life stresses. It may have emboldened them to make different life changes. They suddenly were living embedded in the world in a more effective place. They were taking better psychological, they had learned to take better psychological care of themselves. And as I said, we are mind body. If they're taking better care of themselves, their physiology will change too. Their immune system will function better. There's research on that topic. People who are under a lot of experienced stress, their immune system goes down. It's not working properly. Is the stress causing that? No, one does not cause the other. They are the same thing, just looked at a different level of analysis. The physiological analysis is analysis of what's going on in the body in smaller particles. The analysis of the person is done at the level of a single human being and his or her moods and functioning and the psychology of that being's also embedded in a system of some kind. The system is being changed by his or her behavior too. Everything is changing, but the change at one level is not causing the changes at other levels. And I rested my case. He stopped talking to me that evening. We got our drinks and moved apart. Actually, his wife liked what I was saying, and our families became friends with each other. He stopped hating me, and he became modest about the revolution he thought he was engaged in leading, and became more circumspect. So those three things moved me to move away from anything having to do with physiology and biology and to where I arrived during the 80s and 90s. Uh, the second thing was the publication, not of the DSMs, the DSM 4 or 5, which we had to live by. We were assigned, we had to use this diagnostic nomenclature in order to get reimbursed by health insurance companies. We had to stick one of these terrible labels on the people we were seeing. I didn't like that. I thought we were doing them a great disservice. Uh, the I don't know if I gave this lecture at a previous one. I'll go revisit it again. I used to rant at my graduate students. Anybody who uses the DSM in the way it's intended to be used is guilty of unethical behavior as a psychologist, as far as I'm concerned. We are engaged not in a scientific venture. There's nothing scientific about the DSM-5. There's no science in it whatsoever. There's nothing scientific about it. It is a cultural way of assigning stigma. That's what it is. It's an anthropological document we should look at. It's a statement of behaviors, moods, and other kinds of things that the culture severely disapproves of and wants us to change. We're not supposed to experience those things or emit those behaviors, and those around us want them stopped as well. And people are paid money to get us to try and change them. Now, I said the proof of this, that this is a capitalistic anthropological enterprise, is 100% of the American population has a diagnosis, nervous or mental disease under the DSM-5. I promise you, anybody goes into a provider's office who wants help with any kind of trouble, that person will find some label in the book that can be stuck on an insurance claim form that will get the insurance companies to reimburse. Many of the most unscrupulous around us will find the most extreme and terrible diagnoses to put in the hopes that the most visits could be gotten without being questioned, and the most money can be gotten out of the system for the care of the person there. Uh, and I do not believe that 100% of the American public has something called a nervous or mental disorder. The third proof that there's no nervous or mental disorder, or that the emperor has no clothes, is how are these labels arrived at? I'll tell you the process. Every time there is a revision suggested, a task force of the American Psychiatric Association is brought together. The task force usually consists of professors, interestingly enough, drug company representatives, directors of training centers, and directors of mental health centers, and some people from the private practice centers. And there usually tends to be one social worker and one token psychologist added to the task force. Now, in recent years, the task force has met more often and the revisions are coming more frequently. Is the culture changing? Like, for instance, the diagnosis of conversion hysteria is on the verge of extinction. In Freud's time, it was the most popular diagnosis. If this is a medical problem in physiology, is human biology changing? Is our gene structure changing? Why is this changing with time? I am telling you, it's because of cultural changes. In addition, culture is changing very rapidly. So, eating disorders didn't even appear in DSM 3. Attention deficit disorder did not appear in DSM 4. So are we creating new sicknesses with our culture? Is our genetic makeup changing? So our biology is changing, and these are the repercussions. I have theories about all that, but I'll spare that. I'll just tell you that the task forces are called into being more frequently now. And there is a hidden motive for doing that too. The American Psychiatric Association is in economic distress. Its membership base has been shrinking, shrinking, shrinking over the years of the 20th century. Fewer and fewer psychiatrists are joining the American Psychiatric Association, supposedly the spokesperson for the psychiatric profession. The American Psychiatric Association has two revenue streams. One is membership dues, and that's shrinking. And their most dependable revenue stream is printing and promulgating the DSMs. Every training program has to have them. Every psychiatrist shelf has to have them. Every clinic has many copies of it. Every psychologist in independent practice is purchasing the damn thing. They make millions and millions of dollars every time they put out a new publication. And if they have to declare the old one no longer functional and come up with a new one, they can replenish their revenue stream again. So they have an incentive to do this frequently so they don't go under and become a bankrupt organization. My final complaint about the DSM is it was generated by the bold action of the American government instructing the Medicare, Medicaid, the VA, and the public parts of the healthcare delivery system to stay true to its commitment to being a member of the World Health Organization and to use the international ICD, International Classification of Diseases. That is the physician's Bible everywhere in the world, in every country that has joined the World Health Organization. And it is a compendium of all the physical illnesses and the mental disorders as well. There's a section on nervous and mental disorders in the one that is focused on physical disabilities of one sort or another, illnesses, and it has all the list of all the procedures that are done, and it has a list of all the medication that's prescribed for the various things. So physicians who are coding what it is they've done can universally code in the same way. Now, I started just glancing through the physical parts of the directory when I got myself one. And I came to a realization. The government is fostering this more and more too. For each of the diagnostic categories on the physical health side, they want us to do that too, there is a protocol of what you do to treat that. There are certain treatment code numbers that should be followed. And there are certain medication code numbers that should be followed. Very simple. I can think of a very concrete example. I like using this one when I teach. If somebody comes in with a ruptured appendix and comes into the emergency room, there is a simple protocol. I left out the first step the first few times I taught it. You administer a general anesthetic. That's the first step. Then you take a scalpel and you make a semicircular cut in a certain part of the anatomy, and you lay bare the dermis and then the epidermis and then the dermis and then the fatty layers of tissue, and you enter the body, the abdominal cavity at the site where the ruptured appendix is. You snip off the base of the ruptured appendix and trash the tissue you're pulling out of there. And then you put a really serious lavage into the cavity of the person with certain specified antibiotics that are in liquid suspension. And then you start closing it up. You need the lavage because septic condition can happen if you don't treat the various germs that have been seeping into the cavity from the rupture. Oh, you also culture them. So you take a culture of the pussy remains that are in there, so you can see what kind of and first future antibiotic treatment may be needed post-operatively. Uh, you stitch it up in a certain way. You tell the client what you put them on a dose of antibiotics after the surgery. You may tweak it and change it based on the lab results that come back, but that is the treatment of a ruptured appendix. So what I would ask my students is the agreed upon treatment for a borderline personality disorder. The answer is there are none. For none of any of the labels that we have there is there a universally agreed upon way to proceed with the treatment of that particular condition. And as a matter of fact, there are furious arguments running between vested interest about what should be. On the other hand, if you enter that and say, what are the tests that can be given that prove the presence of any of the nervous mental disorders? What is the MRI results you need? What is the blood test results you need? What is the tissue samples you need that will prove the presence? The answer is zero. There's no agreed upon testing procedure to make a diagnosis based upon physical tissue findings or physical functioning findings that justify the assignment of disorders. They are simply entities that have been created. We also commit another philosophical fallacy. I forgot what the name of this one is, but we go round in circles. It's one from general semantics, treating the name of something as if it were the cause of anything. We see a person who comes in, and under the nervous and mental disorder side and the DSM-5 side, we see there has to be 5 different behaviors that have existed for so many months, and there have to be at least 3 of these 5 things, and then we can label a borderline personality disorder. If you ask my colleagues who have given that label, well, this person has very labile mood and they're cutting themselves and they blow up very easily and they can't form any enduring relationships. They wreck all their relationships. What is causing this behavior? And the answer is the borderline personality disorders is causing this behavior. So because of these behaviors, we say they have a borderline personality disorder, and now the label is causing the behavior. Oh, this is called a tautology. We go around in a very tight circle and think we've explained something. We've explained nothing. There's nothing explanatory about a label. It's just the shorthand. It's supposedly a way of communicating with each other. Instead of naming to a fellow provider what are the particular behaviors that have listed for more than 6 months that are troublesome about this client, we use the label. if I ask them, all right, here are 3 behaviors that are troublesome, what are you going to do about those 3 behaviors? You won't get the same answer from anybody who asks that question to what they intend to do about those 3 behaviors. What would they do if it was 3 other behaviors? They would still give the same label, but what are they going to do about these behaviors? Or moods, what are they going to do to help with these moods? You won't get anything more than 30% overlap with anybody else. There's no regularly recognized protocol of what we should be doing. Oh, if it's a serious diagnosis, the only recognized protocol we have is send this person to a psychiatrist so a course of medication could be instituted. I get so upset when I start talking about these damn things. So I'll rest for a moment and I will try and see if I can get something up on my screen because, as I said, I threw all of this out. I don't want to talk about nervous and mental disorders. I don't want to give psychiatric diagnoses. I don't want to even think about when somebody comes in, what is the diagnosis I have to assign? I would like that to be out of my consciousness so I'm not preoccupied with it. I want a whole other structure, a whole other way that's pure of all that contamination from my perspective and doesn't make any assumptions about what are stigmatized behaviors that should be labeled and overcome. And I have come to rest in, at least for 2 decades, in using labels, ways of thinking, powerful tools that came from lifespan developmental psychology and not at all from mental health technology. So I'm going to leave screens sharing for a moment. And then I'm going to go back, and then I think I can get to where I need to go. Yes, I'm back. Now I can get something else up. Yes, there they are. But that's not what I want. I don't know what you're seeing on the screen at this moment, because I called up the wrong thing. Damn. Ah, I'm having such trouble. I'll try one more time. Oh, I think I know what to do now. Nope, I can't do it. All right, I'll do something else. Sharing my screen is not going to happen. I'll stop my screen sharing. I'll have to set this up for my next lecture. Let me do some foreshadowing. I'm going to be sharing 1, 2, 3, 4, I think 5 documents. I'll try and rattle them off and see if I come back. The first document will be my lifespan perspectives on the individual life cycle. What is it that each human being has to find his or her way through in order to get from birth until it's time to die? There are 10 recognizable nodes of challenge and distress. I like to think of the life cycle very much like a river journey, and I'll use that metaphor. In the beginning, for those who don't know about it, I'll say what I'm talking about. Let us think of making a visit to the Continental Divide. The Continental Divide is a geographic concept. It is a line drawn from the Canadian border to all the way from the Arctic Sea down through the United States on top of the Colorado Rockies. It's the western mountain, the huge western mountain range, down into Mexico and finally into the Gulf of Mexico. That is the line, the Continental Divide, that divides the watershed. So since this is a metaphor about rivers. If you go and stand astride the Continental Divide, somewhere in Colorado, for instance, and put your left foot on the west side of the Continental Divide and your right foot on the east side of the Continental Divide, and face the Canadian border, and have a cup of water in each of your hands and dump them where you're standing. The drops of water in the left-hand one that's on the western side of the divide will eventually wind up in the Pacific Ocean. Those drops of water will make their way slowly and tortuously into the Pacific Ocean, and the drops of water in the right hand cup will make their way into the Gulf of Mexico. Seems almost miraculous and wonderful. I like the metaphor. So what are rivers? Rivers in the beginning are small rivulets. Glaciers in the Colorado Rockies start melting, or rainstorms come and rainstorm falls, and rivulets from the left-hand side facing north, the western side, begin to form little streams, and the stream forms bigger streams, and finally the streams run into lakes at little lower elevations. And we'll stop there for the moment. And again, we are looking at the rise of the creation of what will eventually become rivers, starting with small rivulets and getting into bigger streams, which come together and form rivers eventually. And they're all headed for the Pacific Ocean. And the same process is taking place on the other half of the mountainsides. We are like rivers. As I said, if you're standing there, if you just moved a few paces to the left or a few paces to the right, the river would wind up in a hugely different place. That is like the infant. When the infants are first born, they're very impressionable and very malleable. Doing things to them that are disruptive or sustaining have a much larger impact on what their eventual destination is going to be. Then let's go in the other direction. Let us think about the Mississippi River. It's come together finally with all the water that's fallen to the east side of the Continental Divide, and it's moving. The mighty Mississippi is moving into the Gulf of Mexico in Louisiana. And imagine taking an atomic bomb and a mile upstream from where the estuary is, blowing up a large atomic bomb in the Mississippi River. Well, it would throw up tons of mud and water. It would darken the sky. And you know what? It would displace the river some in one direction or another. But within a reasonable amount of time, the planet would start settling down again. And the Mississippi River would again be flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, approximately where it had been flowing into the Gulf of Mexico before. So what I'm saying to you is that human beings get sturdier with the successful passage of each developmental crisis and the moving on to the next level of development. We can take more stress, we have more resiliency, and we can fight off in a useful way more deformations that are maybe coming up without our asking for them, by bad parenting, by life circumstances, or by whatever. We're not necessarily going to be wounded in such permanent ways over the lifespan as if horrific things happen to us early in life. So that's where I will go next week, and I will stop for today and figure out what to do with the screen sharing so I can have documents to show you, more than one document. So let me rest at this point, and I will open up to my listeners. Who wants to go first?
Arthur, a while ago, when you were talking, a thought occurred to me, and this may be another segment, but I had thought about the concept of why psychotherapy fails. And I don't know if you want to reserve that for another talk, but I thought that was something.
That's a good one. Yeah, I do. That would take me up a full time.
Okay, all right. Then we can
That's
hold
a
off
very,
on
very
that.
reasonable question to ask.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I can sum it up. Most therapists aren't very good.
Well, I like
That's
that.
one.
I'll do some push.
Not this one.
I like that attitude. I think that Helmut Kaiser is right. we do fail. We fail some portion of the time, and we just need to own it. We get so guilty. What we engage in is client blaming, and we usually use the weaponry of the DSM to do the client blaming. Well, what do you expect? You can't get anywhere with psychotics, or the odds were against me from the beginning, or that person had terrible character disorders and was not. I shouldn't have taken them into treatment. We just find the client was not sufficiently motivated. We find something to blame the client for. And Kaiser cautions us, we don't know everything. We're a very young discipline compared to medicine or physics or some other discipline. We'll learn more, we'll get smarter, but it never hurts, it never helps the client blame. We should take responsibility. We don't have to blame ourselves either. Let's be forgiving. Let's just embrace that we're going to fail a good portion of the time, and we don't know what to do about it, and we're confused. I happen to think I know more than some of my colleagues know about what to do about it. We can learn. There are things we're not learning already that I would like us to learn. But certainly there's a huge, much more for us to learn that we don't know anything about it this year of our Lord. So that's only a preliminary talk about why therapy fails, about what not to do. Don't blame the client.
I liked your metaphor around the idea of rivers, like the Mississippi, kind of continuing on its way. It reminded me of kind of like a Rogerian concept of, like the idea that people are somewhat self-righting, that
Yes.
with a little bit of care that they do tend to, kind of, for lack of a better description, maybe get in touch with their true Buddha nature, who they really are,
Yes. We do everything as a culture to teach them to adopt models of who they should be instead of listening to who they are.
And I think I need to brush up on my physical geography, alluvial fans, hydraulic engineering, things like that.
Okay. It's always fun to study what other people are interested in. Anything else for today at the moment?
I think
My
that's it.
No, I'm good.
All right, my diatribes didn't turn you off.
Not at all.
All right, we'll get together and I will figure out how to master the complexities of getting several different documents at different times available to me so I can go from one to another. Have a
Sounds
good
good.
Okay, have a good
Bye.
weekend.